How failed racial politics sink George Clooney's Suburbicon. The actor-director's well-intentioned dark comedy, starring Matt Damon and Julianne Moore, hits a pothole with a curiously misplaced subplot about racism in the 50s. A number of bloodied dead bodies pile up in the course of George Clooney's new film Suburbicon, but they're not the primary source of the sour smell emanating from this manic, distracted and, let it be said, notably white-black comedy. If you were to briefly summarize the premise of the film, which Joel and Ethan Coen wrote in 1986 before setting it aside, which should perhaps be a red flag, you'd principally describe the woes of Gardner Lodge, Matt Damon, a middle-class schlub in 1950s suburbia who gets violently entangled with the underworld after mob goons kill his disabled wife, Julianne Moore. Or so it seems, this being a pastel-noir Coenland of shady truths and shadier motives. The full picture is more complicated than that. Suburbicon Review: George Clooney's picket fence creepfest grows up to be Fargo's idiot child. From a script by the Coen brothers and starring Matt Damon, Clooney's directorial effort takes aim at the suffocating hypocrisy of 50s white bread America, but can't quite land its punches. Read more. So complicated, in fact, that you could complete your essential précis of Suburbicon without even mentioning the even grimmer subplot playing out next door, where the newly arrived African-American Myers family, despite their unimpeachably polite, neighborly behavior, is terrorized by a growing local mob of white supremacists. So as the plot thickens and curdles, Clooney sporadically cuts away from the wacky, grisly goings-on at the lodges to check in on the Myers' frankly harrowing plight. These brief scenes escalate swiftly from a few men's taunts to an organized campaign of over-the-fence harassment to a full-blown, window-smashing, car-trampling racist riot outside the black family's modest house, unfolding in tandem with the panic of Lodge's seamy domestic disaster. For a time, we give Clooney the benefit of the doubt, assuming these ill-coordinated A and B plots will eventually coalesce, informing each other thematically and tonally, or at least narratively. Yet without wishing to stray into spoiler territory, that never quite happens, leaving us with the uncomfortable realization that the sustained abuse of a black family has been used as something of a red herring, a solemn sideshow to a more trivial caper for Damon at his most beleaguered. Clooney and Grantaslav gave the Coen-shelved screenplay a rewrite, and it's not hard to speculate where the joins between drafts may lie. The script never assigns Mr. and Mrs. Myers first names or discernible personalities. They aren't characters but stoic symbolic victims, conceived to illustrate the film's notionally well-meaning satirical portrait of how bad things were back then. Things were bad back then, of course, but they're also pretty terrible now. When shooting a 1950s neo-Nazi riot on a Hollywood set, Clooney presumably couldn't imagine how discomfortingly the resulting footage would evoke real-life events happening in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the year 2017. Life comes at you fast, as the kids say, and by bracketing such events in a mode of larkish Leave It to Beaver parody, by framing them only in terms of how they affect, or, more pointedly, don't affect, the film's white principles, Suburbicon comes undone. It's jaunty, frequently funny and made with liberal intentions, but in the wake of films like Get Out, Jordan Peele's incendiary satire of white supremacy in suburbia, it looks as dated as the world it depicts. George Clooney says alleged Weinstein behavior was indefensible. Read more. I'm far from the only critic to call out the strange, condescending bum note sounded by the film's racial subplot. The general consensus that Suburbicon's optics don't sit right must come as something of a shock to Clooney, the admirable crown prince of liberal Hollywood, whose 2011 thriller The Ides of March mused sternly on the blanket corruption of American politics, and whose good night and good luck stood for the freedom of speech and the media in the face of McCarthyism, another 1950s period piece. Come to think of it, that doesn't look so distant in the Trump era. In person, Clooney earns that reputation. He sincerely takes all the right social and political positions, and has spoken frequently on the issue of faulty racial and gender representation in his industry. How many options are available to minorities in film, particularly in quality films? He despaired to Variety last year, in the wake of a second Oscars So White scandal. I think that African Americans have a real fair point that the industry isn't representing them well enough. We need to get better at this. Why, then, don't his films walk the walk? The fact is that the Mayerses, in all their one-dimensionality, are about the most prominent characters of color in any Clooney-directed film to date. Likewise, he recently decried that women over 40 have a very difficult time being a lead in a movie, but you won't find many of those in his filmography's veritable boys' club of protagonists. Clooney is, of course, free to make the films he wants to make, even ones as porgy and purposeless as Suburbicon's predecessor, Second World War jock romp The Monuments Men, but it's hard not to see that he's having his vanilla cake and eating it. Suburbicon may pose as a knowing satire of white privilege, but its very production is enabled and characterized by that very phenomenon. It's not really fair to single out Clooney, though. This kind of double standard is prevalent in an industry where leftish politics predominate, but straight white men call most of the shots. Advertisement. Look at Clooney's contemporary Alexander Payne, and his muddled social satire Downsizing, which premiered alongside Suburbicon at Venice. The film parodies American consumerism and late capitalism, wrapped around the spiritual redemption of a chino-clad Nebraska milquetoast, Matt Damon, again, but has as its instigator of charitable change an impassioned Vietnamese dissident, Hong Shou, whose broken English and strident manner are played dubiously for laughs. There are some big ideas in Payne's film, but the broad stereotyping of an Asian character to guide along its white savior narrative is its smallest one. It echoes the smugness of Payne's The Descendants, in which the protection of native Hawaiian land proves the moral making of a white male protagonist played by, as it happens, George Clooney. There are gestures of social empathy and solidarity in these films, but perhaps we're at the point where inconsistent flashes of awareness from Hollywood's elder statesmen aren't enough. The actor Elizabeth Banks recently apologized to Steven Spielberg after publicly criticizing him for never making films with female leads. She had momentarily forgotten The Color Purple, of course, but she wasn't entirely off base either. Does one film entirely outweigh 3 subsequent decades of output dominated by white men? These representational biases may not be deliberately enforced, but with every minority or gender-related scandal that rocks the film industry, from Oscars So White to Harvey Weinstein, it becomes increasingly obtuse to ignore them. If George Clooney sees the problem, he too has to be the change.